Okay, you're all set.
Okay. Uh, I invited more people than usual today because that report came out yesterday about the loss of species. And most of us, of course, already knew that, but it adds a new note of alarm to what we're facing really imminently. And so I'm hoping that we might even have more people than usual today to talk about that. And what I specifically want to talk about is the overlay between how one makes a mathematical predictive model and how artists look at the constellations of events to find conclusions. And one of the things that's been bugging me for a long time is in the work, and we talked about a little bit last week, Jim, in the work that you and I did for trigger point tipping points on deltaic systems and conflict zones. That was in 2007. And one of the predictive outcomes was the sheer quantity of migrations that the Earth was going to have to deal with. And another really important one was the prediction that Egypt would be a major conflict zone. And what we discussed last time was that when you're looking at modeling algorithmically, mathematically, it takes time. You can't come up with the verifications you need quickly. But artists working with scientists, I think, can find some of those predictive elements. And what might have happened if in 2007 we had been able to draw major attention to these impending crises. And I know the Army was working on it too, but we had a format that was visually compelling as well as conceptually important. So what I'm hoping to do today is discuss exactly where that interface might be between mathematical modeling and intuitive modeling that, or aesthetic modeling, whatever you want to call it, that might address the scale of the disaster that we're facing right now. So that's my modest plan for the day in the next hour. And before we go any further, I'd like to hear what any of you guys think about this.
Can I give my first thought?
Please.
Yeah, I wanted to draw attention to just to break apart maybe the math side, like can be the role of mathematics, or what is the role of mathematics. That at the very end there's something like modeling, and this is like a very complex process where you have to make a lot of decisions about input, a lot of research, what are possible parameter values. But then there's also kind of let's think like game theory in economics. We can like model economic systems, but we can also look at like toy games or extreme situations, or we can create thought experiments. And in those thought experiments, we sometimes find regions, so kind of tipping points or places where, you know, even climate modeling or price modeling, there's one aspect of it is to create the model, and the other aspect is to just look at which of these parameters really matter. And like, which of these parameters do we have to get correct? So I just wanted to maybe draw attention to this role of mathematics, also to create a certain kind of analytical thought experiments. And I felt that this links with art, because art is also kind of a thought experiment. And also artists can maybe take an extreme thought experiment and use it to create visual imagery even if that thought experiment isn't what's going to happen. So art can draw attention to extreme possibilities, or this landscape of tipping points somehow. So yeah, just wanted to draw attention to this kind of scenarios role or structural role of mathematics, that math can be used to think about structures that are possible, and art of course also looks at structures from a social, personal, spiritual perspective, and math maybe analytically. But
Helena, could you go a little bit further with this term parameters? One reason I'm asking is because coming from something of a GIS background, I often think in terms of layers. So how would you compare the analytic process of identifying parameters to identifying relevant layers?
what do you mean by layers? Like, what is a layer?
Well, in GIS, I'm sure you're familiar with GIS. What you do is you layer statistical data from a number of different sources to figure out where do the indices intersect to imply a relationship.
So yeah, so I'm kind of so this is maybe like it's like you have a certain toolbox. This is like, like you can search for things that are related. You can, like, statistically toolbox to search for things that are related or correlated, or patterns. I'm not too familiar. Like, this toolbox has been growing with data science, like, I don't know. And then you have like maybe if you are thinking of a climate model or a pricing model, you also have often just qualitative descriptions of things that give you, I don't know, in biology or fluid dynamics, you get your differential equation, I don't know, just from volume of water in, volume of water out. But then you have to find a solution to this differential equation. So anyways, and I think what I'm thinking about more is like when you have, maybe you have your parameters, or when you have some equation with a bunch of parameters. In this case, you might ask, like, which parameters, let's say, like, I saw this talk on, which was about carbon pricing, and it was a stochastic differential equation. So let's say you've used some toolbox to figure out some estimates for what parameters should enter into this price and how. You might still be interested, like, how accurate do you have to have each parameter? Like, if you are if your error is large in some parameters, maybe it doesn't change your answer very much. But some parameters are very sensitive. If you change them just a little bit, the answer changes a lot. So those parameters are important to know accurately. That was kind of one, that was a thought.
When we met, Helena, at Ellen's salon, one of the things I mentioned was how obsessed I've been for years now with Maxwell's demon. Because it's the implication that it's possible to identify a point where data can change a system. Simply the awareness and the organization of data can change the way everything is seen.
So what do you mean by that?
Well, in Maxwell's demon, you have the molecules that are sorted by the demon into hot and cold.
Mm-hmm.
And the work, the energy, was simply the sorting process.
Mm-hmm.
And as you know, that has a relationship to the development of IT. So
Mm-hmm.
the implication to me is that if you can identify the correct sorting process, or even the correct data about, or question about why you would do that sorting, you can reorganize systems in substantive ways. And the reason I think that's important is because we are in this imminent catastrophe, and we have to find a way into the problem that deals with the challenge of time and the challenge of mobilizing literally billions of people.
Mm-hmm.
So I wonder whether you or anybody else would like to comment on the relationship between that and what Helena has been describing. Jean, Jim, or Mary Jo, if any of you would like to make a comment about those relationships, I'd be interested.
So I was wondering, Helena, about black swans and in a thermodynamic model for fluid dynamics, you have, I mean, we have gone over the constituents of what fluid is through a pipe. We know about open sourcing, horizontal flows and all that. But what about the things that haven't been developed so well or at all? And I mean, this seems to be a rather unique time in human history. So there are just interrelationships to all this, which engineers usually leave out. So how do we, is there a way to identify the uncertainty of unknowns?
The unknown unknowns.
Well, okay. And I mean, it's not a, it's a, and of course it's a perfect world in other ways outside of our experience, but we don't have a perfect understanding of that world. And so we're using the models as, guideposts and integrators, but sometimes they're used as substitutes for reality, which may not be right, especially when we're dealing with new features. So I just wonder where the mathematical approaches can come to seeing nonlinear features we thought were linear, or on one, I mean, you can model fluid flow through one system on a day-to-day basis, but if you have a hurricane coming through, it's totally different from your model parameters. So if we don't know about a hurricane, how do we know what the tipping point is?
Yes. Yeah.
How to identify these unknowns without knowing them.
Yeah, I mean, like, so like the field I studied was stochastic analysis and probability, and then before that, algebraic geometry. So I'm not gonna claim that I'm like an expert on fluid dynamics equations, but okay, so what I like, and it's not always easy, but what I like, and this was this, I'm doing a project now that has something to do with these climate, like the negotiation aspects of climate, so this game theory. That's why I was attending this talk. And what I found interesting in this pricing model that this mathematician at Oxford was developing was that, you can start first by making your model very complex. You can think about, oh, what if this happens? Well, then this kind of parameters need to be added. What if this happens? So you could, of course, start and make your equation very complex or complicated. And then you could ask, well, qualitatively, which of these parts even make a difference, So I think I was drawing attention to the fact that if the question is like how to yeah, if something is not even something we know how to model because it's so out of it, then maybe we need to also admit that, you know, this is certainly a place where art can come in, or other kind of modes of action. But I think it was also just pointing out that there's also a task of asking, like, where does it pay to be accurate? Like, where does it pay to look at which parts of that complex thing this could affect it, this could affect it, this could affect it, do they all really have an equally important effect? Most likely not. So this is how scientists then are able to create a simplified model that still functions in most situations, but or in, you know, yeah. So I was not saying, yeah, I'm not sure. I can't say anything specific about hurricane modeling.
Well, it's just the uncertainty of, because people are doing all these models, there are assumptions, and of course, we all get locked into our experience. It's hard to jump out of that, and modelers are no different than that. Um, when you're modeling something that you haven't done before, it actually is good to have failures, or at least I mean, it could be construed as good to have failures. Except in this case, we don't want a failure for world climate, the disasters that seem to be coming. So we haven't had experience with that, so therefore we don't have a lot of assumptions, and I don't think as we've constantly learned with the climate model, there are always new adjustments, and so we have to constantly update our assumptions and add things to the model, and our experience basically has shown we are conservative about our estimates for climate change until afterwards, and then we update the model.
I just want to jump in on that. I think this is a really important point, that events that have low probability but huge impact are really hard to build into a model, and hurricane is an example of that. It doesn't happen often, but when it does happen, it has tremendous impact. And there are certainly in the environmental systems, there are many other examples of that. Aviva started us out with one, that massive migrations of climate refugees, hard to model, probably isn't going to happen, you know, all the time, but when it does happen, it's going to definitely make a mess out of whatever economic models we have, or whatever other models we have for dealing with change. And that's hard. I mean, it's hard to get that right, because I mean, Helena's point is really well taken, that you've got to know with high precision about something that has a low probability of happening but has a huge impact when it does happen. And that's a challenge. I mean, it's a challenge for earth scientists. We can't predict hurricanes. We can't predict intensity of hurricanes. We can't predict, 5 years out how many are going to hit what coast or whatever. It's like earthquakes, or huge volcanoes. One of these days, Pompeii is it's going to happen again, and it's going to happen to millions of people. We know it, but we just don't know when. So it's an interesting part of the problem.
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Gene.
I had a graduate student friend who did a really detailed carbon budget of a stream. And so he went out there at least once a week, and usually several times, to measure litter fall and carbon in the stream and in the water and on the bottom, and how much water was going down. And he had a whole year's worth of data, and he was going to do a seasonal daily tremendous record of all the carbon in it. All of a sudden, a storm came.
I thought you were going to say a cow died and fell into the streams.
That too. Essentially was a cow, because it just cleaned out the stream.
Yeah.
And he started it all over again. And, you know, he had a stream that hadn't done this in his knowledge. Of course, he hadn't been out. It's only a couple of decades old. So he had no assumption that it would happen.
Yeah.
And it wasn't in his framework. And those are really nonlinear structures.
No.
Not only are they rare, but they're huge, and they have no, points to connect on that. So,
So one of the things that strikes me in listening to this is that I'm studying 10 ecological art projects by 10 different artists. Most of them in Florida, where I've been working for the past 10 years on trying to encourage ecological art in Florida. And Aviva is one of them, one of the artists, and her Blue Trees project is the project that I'm working on for her chapter. And one of the things that really strikes me about what you've been talking about is the unknown is so prominent among scientists. And we have a mathematician and two, I guess, I'm not sure exactly what your various specialties are in science, but basically science and mathematics, talking about the problems that you have in your silo or your individual silos. And then on the other hand, Aviva is talking about, so as an artist, I really want to engage with your silo and through you. And so what I'm hearing primarily from the scientists and the mathematicians is, well, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but we're so busy trying to figure out what to do about the fact that something gets wiped out, when we're trying to do something, that we really don't have time, to mess with you artists, especially if we have to bring you artists up to speed and be responsible for teaching you enough so that you can actually participate with us in doing our work. And I think that there are two problems with that. One is that the assumption is that artists need to be up to speed. And I think if you look at Aviva's project as an example, the Blue Trees project, she didn't actually start engaging with scientific methods and techniques and theories until she was well into her first project. She began to learn about the science after she had already decided pretty much where she wanted to focus, and she was finding mirrors, which is the way I'm describing it in the chapter I'm writing on her. She found mirrors in science. So it isn't so much a question that Aviva is basing her art in science as she is finding what she needs in terms of working with ecological systems through aesthetic methodology and intuitional methodology, and then finding the science that helps people to understand that, yes, this is a valid way to operate. And I think it's quite fascinating that, again, not to point fingers or anything, but Jim and Jean have been working directly with Aviva for some time, but I don't see Aviva as a participating or artist in either of your institutions, coming in and actually being funded to work with you on an ongoing basis. And that would be really,
pay her to say that.
That would be really a nice, after 10 years, it would seem to me that the time is now for you to take advantage of the work that you have done to bring her up to speed in your areas, and allow her to develop your silo in a greater fashion. I'm finding this actually across all of 10 projects. It's almost, and it's just a small sample. So again, scientists, don't get down on me about about not having a big enough sample. But I just think it's fascinating looking at the small sample that in almost every single case, the artist has not been invited by a scientist. And in fact, any scientists that they have attempted to engage have been very reluctant, and most of them have opted out. And the artist has been left alone. And these are all artists that are working very diligently to try to engage themselves as artists with the kinds of problems that we're talking about today. So I think one of the really serious problems is that we don't have institutional support for training artists. Artists are trained not cross-disciplinarily. So someone like Aviva, who came up in the art world in—
Sorry, Joe, you just froze.
What?
You just froze for a minute.
Oh.
You're back.
Okay, I don't know what I was saying is I don't think there's institutional support. So you could point to MIT, for example, that has a huge cross-disciplinary I wouldn't say I don't it's at all transdisciplinary. I would say that the artists that are involved either as students or as teachers or whatever in MIT are doing primarily work to illustrate what's going on in science. I haven't studied all of MIT's educational approaches, but it seems to me that, if somebody knows of a transdisciplinary project that's come out of MIT that's truly transdisciplinary, then please tell me, because I don't see it. And the other thing that I think is fascinating is that MIT, which is practically the only one out there that is really trying to train artists together with scientists, and in a science-oriented institution as opposed to an art institution, they really are not, they're not attempting to train artists across discipline. It's really, oh, isn't this an interesting kind of weird person who, can engage with technology, and isn't that interesting that they can actually do that and make a picture or a sculpture that is robotic, or participate with a group that can do that. I mean, that's the kind of experience that I'm seeing across the 10 projects that will be in my book. So,
well, let me quickly give a couple of responses to Mary Jo, because I think you brought up a lot of important points, not the least of which is the funding issue. About this business of identifying high impact, low probability events. I think this really is where artists shine. We're really good at finding the little tiny bits of information that are really critical. And the evidence for that, to my mind, is exactly what Jim and I did on that trigger points, tipping points. I'm not sure in that project that we set out to identify where exactly the next point of crisis would be. But the process of talking back and forth and looking at the maps and working with the visuals for a period of time was what revealed that it was obvious that it was going to be Egypt, or it was obvious that it was going to be migration. We didn't look for that in advance. It evolved from the process. So that's a very powerful argument for engaging as equals with artists. And you're absolutely right. And believe me, I talk about this all the time, that the problem of non-support for artists is a really important problem. It just means that aside from the fact that many of us are in dire straits, including myself sometimes, that a lot of work just doesn't happen, or and certainly doesn't get out. For example, any of the predictive elements that we found from this project that addressed migration, we might have had some way to engage in discourse preemptively before it got to this horrendous point that it is at now. The other thing about non-support, on the EcoArt Dialogue, this forum where ecological artists very often talk to each other, somebody brought up the fact that there's a climate museum in New York that's basically doing nothing. And one of the reasons they're doing nothing is because they're trying to raise money for a building, and they don't have really good curatorial support. So it seemed striking to me that as we're facing this incredible catastrophe for the human species and the whole planet, that there is in effect zero support for the kind of transdisciplinary work that we're talking about here that might help. It might help a lot of people. It might help the planet. And the only way I can explain that to myself is that the forces that sustain extractive industries and have solidified classism and colonialism and all the other isms that political scientists analyze are just so powerful that they won't get out of the way, even if we're all going to die. So why should they fund an artist that's going to challenge any of that?
Just a perspective as someone who has worked with artists for, gosh, about 20 years now. I think the most striking thing from a funding perspective that I have seen is the huge disparity between what society spends on science, health, the arts, and the humanities. You know, National Endowment for Humanities and National Endowment for Arts, I mean, they keep trying to make that go away down to zero. They haven't succeeded, but when they get $150 million, they're really happy. National Institutes of Health had a $95 billion, or we spent about $95 billion on health last year. You know, the scale is just jaw-dropping of how different those things are. And you know, when Aviva and I started to work together, and I've worked with Marta Kern and with others, just finding the few bucks here and there to make something happen was really frustrating. And as someone who spent 40 years now in a career in science, I've written, I don't know how many proposals. My lab costs about $1 million a year to run, and I have to raise the money to do that. But those dollars exist at the National Science Foundation, at NOAA and NASA, et cetera. But you can't find, Aviva, we've not been able to find, $10,000 in the art space or in the humanities space. And that's, to me, there's an interesting question there about what society values, why it values it, and how did we get into this situation? As someone who grew up in the science world and then got involved in trying to get money in the art world, it's really striking. And I don't know that, I've not seen a really good study on that. What societally speaking, why is it that we went in that direction? And how is it we got ourselves into this situation? I'll just throw that in.
Part of the problem, I think, is that the art world and the science world are, so separated, and which they didn't used to be, of course, back in the Renaissance, right? We know that from history. And so artists are trained in a certain way to go into the studio and be into themselves. In other words, internal to themselves, and create the art in that fashion. The kind of work that is going to be in my book and that is represented by the Blue Trees Project of Aviva are all artists that are trying desperately to move away from that kind of training, but to keep it because it's valuable, that internal aspect, the intuitional aspect, and apply it in fields where that, not just because it would be fun to operate in the fields, but because these artists feel that they have, as a direct result of this very monastic almost kind of practice that artists are taught to do, and that internally being aware of your emotions, being aware of how your body is in space, and then not so much all in your head the way scientists tend to be. And that is really not valued enough to be able to bring the artist into the science venue. And one of the artists that is in my book, her name is Frances Whitehead, and she is a professor of sculpture at the University of Chicago. And she decided about 15 years ago that she wanted to affect the world, that she was tired of making objects for sale and for exhibition in the museum, and she wanted to invade the design, architecture, engineering area to try to affect much bigger, larger scale projects that had to do with urbanism. And one of the things that she has come up with is, she said, it's a fallacy to say that there's not enough money. She said, if you go and look at the budget of any city, there is plenty of money in there. Anything in the budget, anything in a budget line can be an art project. And it's just a question of whether the city or the institution, be it the University of Colorado or Jean's institution, if you're truly interested in innovation, and I love the word that Aviva uses in her work, perturbation at the edges. Title of my book is Living on the Edge. And I think the edges are where artists need to be placed so that they can push the innovation envelope. That is what they have that is important out of their training to offer. But I think that it's hard for scientists to trust that, because as you say, you have to get the money for your own institution. So, I mean, maybe you're not really that interested in innovation. Maybe you're not really that interested in perturbing edges. Maybe that's not possible for you because of the restrictions that you have to place upon yourself in order to support and to protect your institution. So I would just throw that out there as a challenge, because I think there in your budgets, you have every single item in your budget. If you could look at it that way, every single item in my budget could be an art project if I had the right artist, and since both of you have been working with Aviva for so many years, I'm sure you could go look at your budget and you could figure out some budget line that could support bringing in an innovator, a perturber, somebody who's going to try to make changes at the edges.
Well, perturbation is a term from physics, and what's always so interesting to me is that it relates specifically to chaos theory, and what you're always looking for is the sensitivity to initial conditions. That's the terminology from physics. So I'm curious in terms of what Jim and Mary Jo are talking about in terms of the difficulty of getting past the unconscious biases or whatever it is that makes funding so difficult. Helena, whether you could identify from this conversation something that you would consider peripheral or not obvious, that is a way to look at this as a modeling problem, a mathematically modeling problem, to identify where Maxwell's demon could enter the situation and perhaps find an unexpected solution, a black swan.
So, yeah, maybe I just many things. So first, maybe this Maxwell's demon, sort of the way that you are presenting it. Let's just link it to this. It's kind of representing almost for you this concept of thought experiment.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm coming from theoretical math, and just for rest of the panel, nine years ago, I started focusing on art. So when you're talking about black swans, for instance, you can ask either, like, how can I put this into my model, like add Poisson jump processes so that some insurance company who has now promised to cover hurricanes is going to be able to, or reinsurance company most likely, is going to be able to ask for the right premiums so that we are modeling these hurricanes correctly enough so that the damage amounts are modeled correctly enough. So you can ask about these black swans in this sense. You can ask about the black swans in the sense of just asking how much do we not know. You know, you can also take, like, theoretical math is also full of pushing the analytical extremes, you know, like, and these are kind of thought experiments, and nobody when making the thought experiments is necessarily even thinking that this could be a realistic model, or that, I don't know, like this many hurricanes would ever happen, or no hurricane, you know, but maybe there's just, I don't know, just sometimes I feel like when we try to, if you try, I don't know, I think if you try to put art into the part where you're trying to accurately model a system, I'm not sure that I would instinctively put art there. Because, well, an artist is in a position where artist is also allowed to speculate, for instance. So an artist can present a science fiction project where you have unrealistically modeled black swans. You know, you can put that. You can, you know, you can take extreme thought experiments and present them through art like science fiction scenarios. I don't know. And then maybe the other thought is I'm working on one project that has to do with genetics. And then I just thought to ask, as the scientist, you know, like what would you hope to see in like on art science, or what would you hope to see from art sci, kind of? Or what would be something about your field that you would like to communicate to the general public? This is what I asked. Yeah, what would be something that you'd like to communicate? One person who is doing more computational genetics, he said he'd like people to realize that their genome is like they're like a hand in poker. That you wouldn't show it to everyone. And the other person who is more, you know, doing experiments on mice and specific genes and effects of specific genes, he said, and he's also older researcher, I mean, more experienced, and the other one was a younger guy, first postdoc. Anyways, he said he would just like people to think about life science. Like when he went to the hairdresser, the person has never thought about a cell, never mind CRISPR, you know, or gene editing. So there's also maybe, you know, art has all this social space that it moves in. Art has all this space where it's trying to create space for connections between people, create space for, I don't know, Olafur Eliasson said it nicely. He was talking about it being difficult in our society to be different. And he was saying that art enables different people to have different kind of experiences simultaneously. So some of these difficult topics with climate, extreme events, if you just take a scientist into the room, people might expect a certain precision. They might bow down to the answer in a way that is not helpful for action. But maybe if you put an art project into the room, you can create discussion and you can motivate people for action even if somebody is not giving exactly the answer. So I kind of like to also see the art maybe moving in a different space, because it is asking different questions. It is not asking scientific questions. It is not asking, I think, like, it's not like a pure math exercise where you get theorem and then this theorem is always true. It's moving in this kind of ambiguous, also spiritual space. So I would like to say that a lot of places to work together, but not the same questions. Or
I would argue with that. I think artists and scientists very often ask the same questions, but I think the distinction is that we ask them in very different ways. When Jim and I started to work together, what struck us both is that we were both concerned with the same issues. We both, for example, saw what was happening as a rape of the planet. We were both trying to figure out how do we get from there to some science fiction point. Jean, you haven't said something for a while. What are your thoughts?
Well, I'd go back to what Helena was started with. In defense of artists is the way I would start in part, was that I want to talk about science for a second. I think artists have some, if you want, potentially at least, not all of them, have a training that may be more open and to ways that is not accessible, is readily accessible to scientists maybe, but it could touch some very deep things in people that are not normally gone to or received by the rest of society. So, I mean, I'm going to put artists in the same box as humanities for this discussion. And so they can touch things thousands of years ago a lot easier than we can. I mean, I'm talking about scientists as a population. So we're all in the same genetics, if you will. We all came with constraints and push and pulls about sex and feelings and, you know, all these contrary emotions and drives. But I think the artists have tapped into the inheritance a lot better in some ways than scientists. And I shouldn't use the word better on that, but I just think they have a deeper appreciation for that. And so they can connect with a lot of the social interrelationships that we all have, or we wish we had, or we thought we had, but don't really realize it. And so we get in silos a lot readily. And the situation we're in now is a cause and effect. Artists, you might say, or humanities in general, don't have support because the extractive industries have the upper hand on this for a long time. And so that effect now has a cause back on it. And that's that's what needs to be worked on. And I don't see that we have really strong, except for disaster, I don't see, it's a very slow slog to change those interrelationships. I don't know if I'm making sense here, but.
You're making perfect sense. The only comment I would make on what you said, Jean, is the idea of separating art and science, what art can do, what science can do. Because I think that in the work I've done with you and with Jim that crosses over science and art, when we find something productive, for example, when we worked on Fish Story and identified a point whose restoration near Memphis might affect the Gulf of Mexico, what we were doing was working out of a transdisciplinary model. It was the exchange back and forth that brought us to the conclusions. Now, I don't think you wrote anything up, Jean, from that. Jim did some calculations about the percent of remediation we could have from regreening. And I did some visuals of the installation and a video. I wouldn't say which was a priority of most important, but I think they all came out of the interaction rather than either any of us kind of getting inspired and then going off in our corner to produce something.
No, and the two things, written things that I wrote for that were both about interrelationships. And,
Really? And that referenced fish story?
yes, I sent them.
What
one
do I know? I just work here, Gene.
Well, at any rate, the interrelationships are what gets lost in all of this, and the interrelationships are the ones that are coming back to bite us, and that's what the humanities cover better than a lot of others. Except I'll give ecosystem people an extra plus on that, but those are the things we've all done independently. Like we have silver bullets for this. Wheat farmers going to be treated this way. We're now looking at how the soil changes and what we have to do to affect better carbon storage. You know, it's on the periphery. It's not in the mainstream, and that's intentional. I mean, I'm not saying it's my intention. I'm saying that that's society's intention to keep things segmented that way, and it's almost the task of a lot, well, everybody here to build on those interrelationships to put them back the way they should be, and that's a very social thing. The reason we don't have funding is because people choose to make funding that way. I'll be glad to scrub your budget, Jim, and go over to where we could fund some artists. But I don't have control over a budget. But I do have control over, I have influence on trying to get humanities in general a greater voice on campus, which is what I'm trying to do.
Yeah.
But it's a really tough thing to do. It's like, oh, we'll give you a grain of salt now. You know?
Yeah.
It's
you and I are accustomed to shoving the same rocks up the hill, and we're accustomed to getting run back over by those same rocks.
Same rock, right?
So just out of curiosity, I know you look, Jim, like you're preparing to bolt any moment. So my quick question intuitively for Jim and for Jean is, could you identify in one or two words what might shift the conversation about funding for arts in transdisciplinary collaborations? Just off the top of your head.
What might shift it? I can answer you honestly, and it's I'd say catastrophes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I hate to say that, but that's probably the biggest driver of human, particularly this kind of human behavior.
How much more catastrophic do we need to be?
Oh, there's a lot worse.
Well, look what happened. I mean, Notre Dame burned, and how many billions of dollars showed up within 24 hours? I mean, people respond to that, and you're talking about a functional shift in the way that society views art, way that it views science, the way that it views health. And this is something that's been building up for easily 100 years. This has been building up. We've become more and more of a technological society that values science and undervalues art. Frankly, I think the pendulum has hit the bottom and is swinging back up. We're seeing for the first time in 10 years an increase in the number of students in the arts and humanities at this university, and I think that's a trend across the country. It used to be you would see articles in Forbes and New York Times and Wall Street Journal about, don't get a degree in the arts, you'll never get a job. And now we see more and more articles saying, no, employers want people who have those human skills. I can share with you some of the papers that I've been putting together on employment over the last 10, 20, 30 years. It's behind the scenes seemingly without us paying a whole lot of attention to it. Employers are out there hiring arts and humanities majors and hiring social science majors.
I think one thing, this is Daisy,
and
listening.
They hire them because these are the people who are far more capable of expressing themselves,
They're
far more
creative.
capable
That's what it is, too.
of interacting with other people, far more capable of being part of a team. And the Googles and the Amazons and everybody, they're hiring them. I mean, Google used to hire engineers all the time. Now they're more inclined to hire arts and sciences majors. So I think things are changing, but you know, in order to answer your question, it's going to have to be a catastrophe. It's going to have to be a seismic shift. I'm sorry. That's.
Do you agree with that, Gene?
Uh, I don't think disasters come in all kinds of sizes, right? They could be global, they could be local. And one of the local ones we had here was that for the first time since the last couple hundred years, the place flooded. We had, you know, half the homes were flooded in this town. And so now there's money to look at drainage finally, because the developers are still, you know, plugging ahead. So for the first time this year, the restoration class had a group project spontaneously in front of me. I just let it form and guided it a little bit. And we have a report on green corridors. I know it's a small step, but getting green spaces linked in the parish. It's the county, basically. And so we've worked with the city government, and we're going to continue on that. We have a little small report on it. And we're hoping to combine the drainage silver bullet with the wildlife one and people's health and other things, you know, accidents, cars running into deers and things like that, and to kind of a more integrative framework for conserving what's hopefully going to remain left, not lost further over time. So that it was a disaster. It has had an effect, and we're trying to use it to kind of have a more total view of water movement and people's health in the parish. So you know, I don't know if it's going to be, well, I do suspect it's not going to be fast enough, but I have to admit. But I mean, there are some changes amidst the dark clouds. So.
All right, now you can yell at me because I have to go.
Okay, I'm just curious before Jim has to go. Just
you held out until 3:28 Eastern Standard Time. That's not bad, Jim.
So I was just hoping that Jim wouldn't leave before he could quickly answer this question. I'd like to hear from each one of the folks who are from academia. To what degree are you personally or your department engaging with the art departments around preparing artists or artists in training and preparing your students who are in your field to work across discipline?
On a scale of 1 to 10, quick, Jim.
It's a lightning round.
I'd say we're probably a 6. We want to be a 9.
All right, Gene.
I can't grasp the question, but the department, personally, 2 or 3 or 4, and as a department, practically, I'd say 1.
Oh God, and you've got Brandon there too, Brandon Bauer.
Helena?
So I'm not working, I switched to being an artist. So I'll just say I do have one friend in New York, the math professor. He's now at Sarah Lawrence. And I would think his efforts are definitely a 10, and Sarah Lawrence is probably a 10. Yeah. He's done math classes for dancers. He's advises a lot of student projects. Sarah Lawrence is structured so that most of the work is projects.
Right.
He just wrote a book called 99 Ways of Proving the Same Theorem. It's a play on like a literary work of a similar thing. So anyways, yeah, I think not unusual, but I have that one positive example to put out there. Most departments are 0, but.
Okay, so does anybody want a last word on the topic? I'm not sure that we came up with any modeling for catastrophe.
I think we need to do what Donna Caraway suggests and stay with the trouble. If you all haven't read her book, you should read it. The fabulous book about, why we can't give up. Excellent. Biologists by training.
Anyone else? Jean, do you want to have a couple last words on this?
Last words. I think I got the gist of the title out of the title, and I agree. That's often the fun but risky, you might say, and uncertain ground if it goes underneath you.
Hmm. Yeah, she's amazing about how she brings all different kinds of art and science together. You'll enjoy it. Staying with the Trouble by Donna Haraway.
Well, I'm going to give myself the last word, which is I don't think it's adequate to wait for the catastrophe, no matter how much we stay with the Trouble. I think we have to look for the black swans because
I
they're
agree.
the only thing that's going to save us.
Yeah, and I think that's what Donna Haraway says, so that's why I highly recommend the book.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you,
Thanks,
guys.
everyone.
All right.
Wonderful conversation.